I was still in a hospital gown, holding a plastic bag of painkillers and discharge papers, when I opened the door to my own apartment and stopped so hard my sister almost walked into my back. My bed, the one that had lived against the far wall since the day I moved in, was gone from that wall. It was sitting 4 feet from where I'd left it, angled so the headboard nearly touched my roommate's, like someone had pushed two twin beds together and lost their nerve halfway through admitting what they were doing. My name is Wes Bennett. I'm 29, and 3 days earlier I had been rushed into emergency surgery for a burst appendix while my roommate sat in a waiting room chair refreshing her phone every 4 minutes because the nurses wouldn't tell her anything since she wasn't family. I didn't know that part yet. All I knew, standing in the doorway of our shared apartment with stitches pulling under a hospital bracelet I hadn't bothered to cut off, was that something in this apartment had changed while I wasn't looking, and I had a very strong feeling it wasn't just the furniture. Let me back up, because this story doesn't make sense without the 8 months before it. I moved into that apartment in downtown Denver after my old lease fell apart along with the relationship that came with it. Nothing dramatic, just two people who had been dating out of convenience finally admitting the convenience had run out. I needed a place fast, and a coworker mentioned her friend was looking for a roommate to split a 2-bedroom near the light rail. That friend was Jessie Hartman, 28, a physical therapist with a laugh that carried through walls and a habit of leaving sticky notes on the fridge that ranged from grocery reminders to, on one memorable Tuesday, a fully drawn cartoon of our cat judging me for eating cereal at midnight. We didn't have a cat. She drew one anyway, for emotional accuracy, she said. We were not friends before we were roommates. We were strangers who signed a lease together because the math worked and the reviews checked out. That's supposed to be a purely logistical arrangement. Split the rent, split the Wi-Fi bill, nod politely in the hallway, keep your business in your own room. That's how it starts for most people. It did not stay that way for us, though neither of us would have admitted that out loud for a long time, because admitting it meant naming something neither of us had agreed to feel. The first week was exactly as awkward as you'd expect two strangers folding their lives into the same square footage to be. We labeled shelves in the fridge with masking tape. We had a brief, entirely serious negotiation over thermostat settings that ended in a compromise neither of us actually liked, which is probably the definition of a good compromise. She caught me watching a cooking show I was embarrassed to admit I watched, and instead of teasing me, she sat down on the opposite end of the couch and asked genuine questions about knife technique, which somehow disarmed me more than mockery would have. I caught her crying at a commercial for a pet adoption charity and pretended I hadn't seen it, which she later told me she noticed and appreciated more than she let on at the time. Jessie was blunt in a way I found unreasonably attractive before I let myself notice I found her attractive at all. She had dark red hair, she kept in a messy knot on top of her head, freckles across her nose that got darker in summer, and the kind of energy that filled a room without ever raising her voice. She worked 12-hour shifts at a rehab clinic, came home smelling like hand sanitizer and exhaustion, and still managed to ask about my day like she actually wanted the real answer instead of the polite one. Most people ask how was work the way you ask how are you, expecting fine and moving on. Jessie would follow up. She'd ask what happened in the meeting I mentioned complaining about 3 days earlier. She remembered things. That should have told me something a lot sooner than it did. We fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Thursday nights became unofficial takeout nights. Whoever got home first picked the place. The other one didn't get a veto, just a right to complain while eating it anyway. We developed a system for the shared bathroom that involved a folded towel over the door handle instead of a lock, because the lock stuck and neither of us trusted it. We watched terrible reality shows and narrated them like sports commentators. She learned I hated when people left cabinet doors open. I learned she couldn't function before coffee and shouldn't be spoken to directly until she'd had at least half a cup. Small things. Roommate things. Except somewhere in the middle of all those small things, I started noticing the shape of her laugh before I noticed the joke that caused it. And that's usually where trouble starts. There was a night, maybe month 3, when a storm knocked the power out and we ended up sitting on the kitchen floor with candles and a bag of chips, talking for 3 hours about nothing important. And I remember thinking, with the sudden clarity that only hits you at inconvenient moments, that I hadn't wanted a storm to end that badly in my entire adult life. I filed that thought away somewhere I didn't have to look at it too closely. That became a pattern of its own, filing things away instead of examining them. And looking back now, I think that particular skill was the only real obstacle standing between us for most of that year. I dated other people during those 8 months. So did she. That's the part that used to embarrass me most when I told this story later. How obvious it must have looked to everyone except us. I went out with a woman named Naomi for 6 weeks that fizzled out over nothing in particular. Jessie went on a handful of dates with a guy from her gym who, according to her, talked about his own personality like it was a brand he was actively marketing. Every time one of us came home from a date, the other one would be sitting on the couch pretending not to have waited up, and there'd be this ritual of debriefing that felt a lot more like two people gathering evidence against every alternative to each other than two roommates being supportive. I didn't see it then. I see it now with the kind of clarity that makes you want to reach back in time and shake yourself by the collar. Once, after a date with Naomi that had actually gone reasonably well, I came home to find Jessie still awake, curled on the couch under a blanket that was technically mine, and instead of feeling relieved that the date had gone fine, I felt an odd flatness settle over me the moment I sat down across from her and started describing it. She asked all the right questions. She smiled at all the right places. And underneath all of it, I remember specifically thinking that I wished I were telling her about her instead of about someone else, a thought so strange and unwelcome that I actively pushed it out of my head before it could finish forming. I didn't examine why. That was the whole problem with those 8 months, honestly. Neither of us examined anything. We just kept living side by side, collecting small evidence of something neither of us was brave enough to name. Then came the Tuesday that put me in a hospital bed. I'd been having stomach pain for 2 days and calling it bad Chinese food, because that's what men do. We downgrade every symptom until it becomes an emergency loud enough to override our pride. By Tuesday night, I was doubled over on the kitchen floor, sweating through my shirt, unable to stand up straight. Jessie found me there when she got home from a late shift. She didn't panic, or if she did, she hid it well enough that I only found out about the panic afterward, secondhand, from her best friend Devin. She got me into her car instead of waiting for an ambulance because the ER was 11 minutes away, and she said later that 11 minutes felt like a luxury she wasn't willing to gamble with. I remember pieces of that drive. I remember her hand landing on my knee at a red light. Not romantic, just steady, like she needed to feel that I was still there. I remember her voice staying calm while she called ahead to the hospital, giving them my symptoms in the clipped, professional cadence of someone who spent her days around medical charts. I remember thinking, somewhere in the haze of pain, that I trusted this woman with my life in a very literal sense, and wondering distantly why that thought felt bigger than it should have for a roommate. I also remember, oddly, the small detail of her running a red light 2 blocks from the hospital, something Jessie, the physical therapist, would have lectured any patient about doing, and how she muttered sorry to no one in particular as she did it, like she was apologizing to the universe for breaking her own rules just this once. They took me back fast once we got there. Ruptured appendix, the doctor said, emergency surgery, no time to wait for family to arrive from out of state. Jessie stood in the hallway and told the intake nurse she was my emergency contact before I could correct her, because my actual emergency contact, my mother, was a 4-hour flight away, and Jessie apparently decided that logistics beat technicalities. Nobody questioned it. I found out later she sat in that waiting room for 6 hours, through the surgery and into recovery, only leaving once to get coffee she never drank, because she was afraid she'd miss someone coming out to update her. Devin told me later, after everything had come out into the open, that she'd gotten a phone call around hour 4 from a Jessie who sounded nothing like herself, quiet and shaking, saying things like, "What if I never told him? And what if this is it, and he never knows?" which Devon dutifully saved as evidence for exactly this kind of moment. The moment where she could sit me down over wine months later and say, very smugly, "I knew before you did, by the way. Everyone knew before you did." When I woke up groggy and disoriented, the first face I saw wasn't a nurse. It was Jessie, curled into an uncomfortable chair with her knees pulled up, hair falling out of its knot, scrolling through nothing on her phone because she'd run out of things to distract herself with hours earlier. She looked up when I stirred, and the relief that crossed her face was so immediate, so unguarded, that even sedated and disoriented I noticed it didn't look like the relief you feel for a roommate. It looked like something closer to what people feel when they've been quietly terrified of losing someone they never said out loud that they loved. "Hey," she said softly, leaning forward. "You scared me." "Sorry," I mumbled, throat dry. "Bad timing." "Terrible timing," she agreed, and something in her voice cracked just slightly before she caught it. "You couldn't have picked a night I wasn't working a double. I'll circle it on the calendar next time." She let out a shaky laugh and reached over to squeeze my hand, and for a second neither of us said anything, because some moments don't need narration, they just need to be survived together. I spent 3 days in that hospital. Jessie came every single day, sometimes on her lunch break, sometimes straight from a shift still wearing her work badge. She brought a phone charger I hadn't asked for, snacks the hospital cafeteria didn't sell, and a small stuffed animal from the gift shop that she claimed was for the room, not for you specifically, which fooled absolutely nobody, especially not the nurse who winked at her when she said it. On the second night, she fell asleep mid-sentence in that same uncomfortable chair while telling me about a patient who'd sworn off physical therapy entirely because his dog had once knocked over his walker, and I remember lying there watching her sleep, exhausted and stitched together and drugged into a fog, thinking that I would have signed off on a dozen more surgeries if it meant she kept showing up like this. My mother flew in on day 2, took one look at how Jessie navigated the doctors, the paperwork, the medication schedule, and pulled me aside to say, very quietly, "That girl is not just your roommate, Wes," in the tone mothers use when they've already figured out something you haven't caught up to yet. I told her she was wrong. I told her Jessie was just a good person, the kind of good person who would have done the same for any friend. My mother gave me the look mothers reserve for sons who are lying to themselves more than they're lying to her, and let it go, because she knew, better than I did apparently, that some truths need to arrive on their own schedule. Before she left for her flight, she hugged Jessie for a beat longer than a polite goodbye required, and said, "Thank you for taking care of my son," and Jessie's eyes went glassy in a way she blamed on hospital lighting the entire ride home. They discharged me on a Friday afternoon with instructions to rest, avoid heavy lifting, and take my medication on time. Jessie picked me up because my mother had a flight to catch and I insisted I'd be fine, a decision I regretted for approximately the first 4 minutes of the ride home, when every pothole felt like a personal attack on my abdomen. Jessie drove carefully, glancing over at me every few blocks with an expression somewhere between concern and something else I couldn't name yet, and by the time we pulled up to our building, I was exhausted in the specific way that comes from being in pain and pretending you're not. She got my bag from the trunk before I could argue, walked slightly ahead of me up the stairs like she was clearing a path, and unlocked the apartment door with the kind of quiet efficiency that told me she'd been thinking about this moment, planning it, in a way that should have warned me something was different. Then I walked into my room and stopped. My bed was against the wrong wall. For a second, my brain refused to process it as anything other than a mistake. I actually turned around, checked the number on the door like I might have wandered into someone else's apartment by accident. But no, it was my room, my desk still cluttered the same way I'd left it, my jacket still hanging off the same chair. Just the bed itself moved. Pulled away from the wall it had lived against for 8 months, angled toward Jessie's room instead, close enough now that if both our doors stayed open, which they usually did, the 2 beds practically faced each other across the narrow gap between rooms. "Jessie," I said slowly, setting my bag down carefully so I didn't strain anything. "Why is my bed over here?" She appeared in the doorway of her own room, arms crossed loosely, looking somewhere between defiant and embarrassed, an expression I hadn't seen on her before and couldn't immediately categorize. "I moved it while you were in the hospital," she said, like that explained everything. "I can see that. I'm asking why." She hesitated, and Jessie almost never hesitated. She was the most direct person I knew, the kind of woman who told you exactly what she thought about your haircut, your cooking, your taste in music, without softening any of it. Watching her search for words felt like watching someone I knew do something completely out of character, which, in a way, she was. "Because the first night after your surgery," she said finally, "I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check on you. And your room felt so far away down that hallway. And she stopped, exhaled hard through her nose. "I moved it back before you got discharged. I was going to. And then I didn't. And then it was Thursday. And then it was today. And I ran out of time to fix it before you saw. You were going to move it back." "Yes. But you didn't." "No." I stood there, one hand braced against my door frame because standing too long still pulled at my stitches, staring at a bed that had somehow become the most complicated piece of furniture I'd ever owned. "Jessie, be honest with me. Was this actually about checking on me at night, or was there something else going on?" She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her decide something, the way you can sometimes watch a person cross an internal line they'd been standing at for a while. "Both," she said quietly. "It started as checking on you. And then somewhere around night 2, I realized I didn't want to move it back, and that scared me more than your surgery did." The hallway between our rooms suddenly felt very small. I lowered myself carefully onto the edge of my repositioned bed, partly because my stomach was starting to protest the standing, and partly because I needed a second to catch up with what she'd just said. "Scared you how?" She leaned against her doorframe, arms still crossed, but softer now, like the posture of someone bracing for a conversation rather than defending a decision. "You want the real answer or the roommate-appropriate answer?" "I think we're past roommate-appropriate, Jess. You told the hospital you were my emergency contact." That got a small, startled laugh out of her. "You heard about that." "My mother told me. In great detail. With significant editorializing." "Of course she did." Jessie shook her head, but the laugh faded into something more serious. "Okay, real answer. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours convinced I was going to lose you before I ever told you how I felt, and somewhere an hour before I promised myself that if you woke up okay, I wasn't going to keep pretending this was just roommate stuff anymore. Then you woke up, and you were groggy, and it felt like the wrong time. And then you were recovering, and it still felt like the wrong time. And then I moved your bed 4 feet closer to mine, because apparently my subconscious decided actions were easier than words." She let out a breath. "So, that's the real answer. I've been in love with you for months, Wes, and I panicked and rearranged furniture instead of saying it like a normal person." I sat there absorbing that, the pull in my stitches suddenly the least uncomfortable thing in the room. 8 months of Thursday takeout nights, of remembered details and midnight debriefs about bad dates, of a hand on my knee at a red light that I told myself was just steadiness and not something warmer, rearranged itself in my head into a different picture entirely, one that had apparently been forming the whole time, while I called it friendship out of some reflexive need to keep things simple. "I think," I said slowly, "that I've been doing the same thing, just without the furniture." Jessie's arms uncrossed. "What does that mean?" "It means every time I came home from a date with someone else, the only opinion I actually cared about was yours. It means I used to lie awake wondering if you were still up, not because I needed anything, just because I liked knowing you were close by. It means I've been calling this roommate stuff for 8 months, because the alternative required admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud either. It means that storm night, back in month 3, when the power went out and we sat on the kitchen floor for 3 hours, I remember thinking I didn't want it to end, and I told myself that was about the chips." That got a real laugh out of her, wet and surprised. "It was good chips. It really wasn't about the chips, Jess." "No," she agreed softly. "I don't think it was." She crossed the small gap between our doorways and stood in front of me, close enough now that I had to tilt my head up slightly to look at her properly. So we're both idiots. Spectacular idiots, I agreed. World class. I moved a whole bed, Wes. Do you understand how heavy that bed frame is? I have a job that requires me to lift people for a living, and I still pulled something doing this. That startled a laugh out of me, which immediately hurt my stitches, which made her wince in sympathy and then laugh too. And for a second, the whole heavy weight of the conversation cracked open into something lighter, something that felt like relief finally getting room to breathe. So what happens now? I asked, with the bed situation specifically. Jessie glanced over her shoulder at the 4 feet of space between our 2 rooms, then back at me, a small, deliberate smile forming. I think the bed stays where it is. For now. Symbolically. Symbolically. Don't make it weird. I'm not the one who rearranged furniture while I was in a hospital bed. No, she said. You're the one who apparently needed emergency surgery to admit you had feelings for your roommate. So let's not compare methods here. I couldn't argue with that, and honestly, I didn't want to. I reached for her hand, the same way she'd reached for mine on that hospital bed 3 days earlier, and she let me take it, lacing her fingers through mine like it was the most natural motion in the world, like we'd been doing it for years instead of just starting. For the record, I said, I would have gotten there eventually. Without the appendix. Would you have? Because 8 months is a long time to circle something, Wes. Fair point. I tugged her hand gently. Sit down before I fall over trying to look up at you like this. My stitches have opinions about posture. She sat beside me carefully, mindful of my side, and for a while we just stayed there in the quiet, her shoulder against mine. The moved bed a strange and unexpected monument to 8 months neither of us had understood clearly until a medical emergency forced the issue. That should have been the neat ending. Discovery, confession, resolution, the kind of tidy arc that wraps up in a single conversation. Life rarely cooperates with tidy, though, and ours didn't either. Jessie had an older brother named Derek, 32, who had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of her romantic life ever since their father passed away 4 years earlier. Derek lived across town, worked in finance, and had opinions about everyone Jessie dated with the confidence of a man who'd never once been asked for those opinions. He'd met me exactly twice before the hospital, both times at family gatherings Jessie invited me to as her roommate, both times with a handshake just a little too firm and a smile just a little too measured, the universal language of a man deciding whether you're a threat. He found out about us 2 weeks after I got discharged, when Jessie mentioned casually during a phone call that she and I were figuring things out. Derek, apparently, did not take casual well. He showed up at our apartment on a Sunday afternoon unannounced, which Jessie later told me was very on-brand for him. The kind of man who believed showing up uninvited was a form of care rather than an imposition. I opened the door because Jessie was in the shower and found myself face to face with a man in a quarter-zip sweater and an expression that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation on the drive over. Wes, Derek said, stepping past me into the apartment without quite being invited. We need to talk. Sure, I said, closing the door slowly, still moving carefully thanks to the healing incision. About you and my sister. He turned to face me in the living room, arms crossing in a gesture I recognized because I'd seen a softer version of it on Jessie a dozen times. She told me you two are together now. I have concerns. I'd love to hear them. Derek's jaw tightened at what he apparently read as sarcasm, though I meant it sincerely enough, mostly because I wanted to know what I was dealing with before Jessie got out of the shower, and this conversation escalated into something neither of us could walk back easily. You were roommates for 8 months, Derek said. Purely practical arrangement. That's what she told me when she moved in with you. And now, suddenly, right after some medical emergency, you two are a couple? Forgive me if that timeline concerns me. It concerns you because it happened fast, or because it happened at all. Both, honestly. Derek's tone sharpened. Jessie has a pattern, Wes. She gets attached to men who need taking care of. Her last boyfriend before she moved in with you. She basically ran his life for 2 years while he coasted. I watched her burn herself out fixing a man who never once asked what she needed in return. Now you almost die, and suddenly she's rearranging furniture and falling in love. Does that sound healthy to you? Or does that sound like a woman repeating a pattern that already hurt her once? That landed harder than I expected, mostly because I could tell Derek believed every word of it, and because underneath the overprotective delivery there was a real fear worth taking seriously, the fear of watching someone you love pour themselves into another person who might not pour anything back. I hear you, I said carefully, and for what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong to worry. But I think you're wrong about what this is. Convince me. I'm not going to convince you in one conversation, Derek. But I'll tell you what I know. Jessie didn't take care of me because I needed taking care of. She took care of me because that's who she is with everyone she loves, and I intend to spend a lot of time making sure that care goes both directions. Because I watched her sit in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours without eating, and I don't ever want to be the reason she does that again without someone doing the same for her. Derek studied me for a long moment, some of the rigidity in his posture loosening slightly, though not entirely. Pretty words. Anyone can say pretty words. Sure. But you've known me for 2 handshakes and 1 hospital story secondhand. Give it more than that before you decide I'm the pattern you're worried about. That's easy to say now, when everything's new and everyone's still on their best behavior. It is, I admitted. So watch. Don't take my word for it. Watch what I actually do over the next year. And if I turn into the man you're describing, you'll have every right to say so, and I won't argue with you. Something in Derek's expression flickered, like he hadn't expected that particular answer and wasn't sure what to do with it now that he had it. Before he could respond, Jessie's voice cut through the apartment, sharp and immediate. Derek, what are you doing here? She stood in the hallway, hair still damp, wrapped in a robe, staring at her brother with an expression that made it very clear this ambush was not appreciated. Derek, to his credit, at least had the decency to look slightly caught. I was worried about you, he said. You were worried about me. So you came to interrogate my boyfriend without me here? Derek, that's not concern, that's control, and we've talked about this before. Jessie, no. She crossed her arms, and I recognized the posture instantly now. Understood exactly where she'd learned it from. Dad died 4 years ago, and somehow you decided that made you responsible for every decision in my life. And I have let that slide because I know why you do it, but this stops today. I am not repeating what happened with Colin. Wes is not Colin. How do you know that already? It's been 2 weeks. Because Colin never once sat with me for 6 hours in a waiting room, Derek. He barely noticed when I had a bad day, let alone a medical emergency. Wes didn't ask me to take care of him. I chose to, because that's what you do for people you love, and it terrifies me that you can't tell the difference between choosing someone and losing yourself to them. The apartment went quiet in that particular way that happens after someone says something true enough to leave no easy response. Derek's jaw worked for a moment, and when he spoke again, some of the fight had gone out of his voice. I just don't want to watch you get hurt again, he said quietly. That's all this is. I know, Jessie said, softening slightly. But you don't get to decide that by ambushing the man I'm dating in our own living room. If you have concerns, you bring them to me. Directly. Like an adult. Not like you're conducting an interview. Derek looked at me, then back at his sister, and something in his expression finally settled into something closer to acceptance, even if it wasn't complete yet. Fine. Direct concerns from now on. Starting with this one. If you hurt her, he said, turning to me, I will make your life extremely inconvenient in ways that are technically legal. Noted, I said, fighting the urge to smile. For what it's worth, I don't plan on giving you the opportunity. He gave a short nod, not quite warm, but no longer hostile, and let himself out shortly after with a mumbled apology to Jessie for the ambush, though not, notably, an apology to me, which Jessie later told me was actually significant progress for Derek, who apologized to almost no one on principle. After the door closed, Jessie turned to me, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath through the entire exchange. I'm sorry about that. He means well. He just doesn't always know how to show it without making everything worse. He's not wrong to be careful, I said. You clearly matter to him. I'd rather deal with an overprotective brother than one who didn't care at all. You're being remarkably gracious about a man who basically accused you of being a red flag 5 minutes after you got here. I've been called worse by better people, I said, and she laughed, some of the tension from the last 20 minutes finally draining out of her shoulders. Derek's visit turned out to be the sharpest edge of an otherwise gradual adjustment. Word got around, the way it does, and Jesse's friend Devin showed up a few days later with a bottle of wine and an interrogation of her own, though hers was considerably friendlier, mostly consisting of demanding details and threatening to cry over how the bed-moving story had gone. Devin made Jesse tell the whole thing twice, once for herself and once, apparently, so she could record part of it on her phone for posterity, a recording Jesse found out about and made her delete, unsuccessfully, because Devin later played a clip of it at our wedding. My own friends took the news with the particular mix of amusement and vindication reserved for people who watched you dance around an obvious feeling for months without naming it. My buddy Tyler informed me flatly that he'd told me to make a move back in March, and I owed him a beer for every month I'd stubbornly ignored the advice, which by his count came out to 5 beers, a debt I paid without argument. Another friend, Marcus, simply sent a single text that said finally with no punctuation and no further explanation, which somehow felt like the most accurate summary of the entire situation. The bed situation resolved itself naturally within a few weeks. We didn't discuss moving in together formally, not at first. It just sort of happened the way these things do when two people who already share an apartment start sharing everything else too. My room became storage for things neither of us used often, old boxes, a desk I rarely sat at, a treadmill that had become an expensive coat rack. Jesse's room became, unofficially, ours. The 8 months of careful roommate boundaries dissolved into something that felt less like a change and more like a correction, like we'd finally arranged our lives to match something that had been true underneath the surface for a long time. Recovery from the surgery took about 6 weeks total before I felt fully back to normal, and Jessie spent every one of those weeks fussing over me in ways I pretended to find excessive and secretly loved completely. She tracked my medication schedule on her phone with the same seriousness she brought to her actual patients. She banned me from lifting anything heavier than a coffee mug for the first 2 weeks, a rule I broke exactly once trying to move a box, earning myself a lecture delivered with far more affection than anger, complete with her physically standing between me and the offending box like it was a dangerous animal. She started leaving notes again, the same sticky note habit from before, except now they said things like "proud of you for resting today," instead of cartoon cats judging my cereal choices. And somehow that small shift in tone told me everything about how much had actually changed between us, even though on paper we were still just 2 people sharing rent in a 2-bedroom apartment near the light rail. 3 months after the hospital, Jesse and I had our first real fight, the kind every couple eventually has once the honeymoon adjustment wears thin enough to reveal the actual texture of 2 lives merging. It was about something small, really, an argument over whether I'd been too dismissive of her exhaustion after a rough week at the clinic, whether I'd offered help or just offered opinions about how she should handle her own stress. We both said things sharper than we meant. She told me I sometimes tried to fix problems instead of just listening. I told her she sometimes shut down instead of asking for what she actually needed. It wasn't a screaming match. We weren't those people, but it was real, uncomfortable, the kind of disagreement that tests whether a relationship built on 8 months of quiet roommate affection can survive actual friction now that the stakes were higher. There was a bad hour in the middle of it where she went quiet in that specific way Derek had described, the way that used to worry me because I didn't yet have the language for it. And I almost let her retreat into it the old way, the roommate way. The way where you give someone space because it's polite and call it respect. Instead, I sat down on the floor in front of where she'd curled into the corner of the couch and said, plainly, that I wasn't going anywhere and she didn't have to perform being fine for me. That cracked something open in her that the fight itself hadn't managed to, and she finally told me, voice shaking, that she was terrified of becoming exactly what Derek feared, someone who gave everything to a relationship and quietly disappeared inside it. I told her I was terrified of the opposite, of being someone who let the person who saved his life do all the saving forever while he coasted on gratitude instead of building something equal. We worked through it that night, sitting on the same bed she'd moved 4 feet across a room months earlier, talking until nearly 2 in the morning about what we each needed when things got hard, about the difference between fixing and supporting, about the fact that neither of us had much practice being fully honest with a partner because both of us had spent our previous relationships holding something back. It wasn't a magic conversation that solved everything instantly. It was just honest and messy and real in a way that felt more solid afterward than any of the easy months before it, because we'd proven to each other that disagreement didn't have to mean disaster. Derek came around eventually, slower than Devin had, but steadily. He watched me show up consistently over the following months, at family dinners, at Jesse's cousin's wedding where I stood beside her the entire reception instead of drifting off to talk to strangers, at a particularly brutal week when her clinic lost a longtime patient and I drove 40 minutes each way for 3 nights straight just to be there when she got home, not saying much, just being present, making tea, sitting with her while she cried it out on the same couch where Derek had once accused me of being a pattern she was repeating. Somewhere around month 5, Derek showed up to a family barbecue, handed me a beer without being asked, and said, gruffly, "You're all right, Wes," which Jesse later informed me was the single highest compliment her brother had ever paid anyone outside their immediate family. And I understood then exactly how much weight that overprotective visit had actually carried underneath the confrontation. A year after the hospital, almost to the day, I proposed to Jessie in the apartment, in our bedroom, standing in the exact spot where her bed had once sat 4 feet closer to mine than either of us had been ready to admit meant anything. I didn't do it with a crowd or a grand gesture in some scenic location. I did it quietly, on a Tuesday evening, because Tuesday was the day I'd nearly died on her kitchen floor, and I wanted to give that date a different meaning going forward, something worth remembering for a reason other than fear. "I've been thinking about that bed," I told her, kneeling in the same spot she'd stood defending her decision to move it, ring in hand, heart somewhere in my throat despite months of certainty leading up to this moment. "About how you moved it 4 feet closer because some part of you already knew, even before either of us said it out loud. I think I've known just as long. I just needed a ruptured appendix and a very stubborn brother to catch up to what you already understood." I looked up at her, watching her hands come up to cover her mouth, watching tears gather in eyes that had once stared me down across a hospital waiting room chair for 6 straight hours without blinking. "Jesse Hartman, will you marry me? Officially. No more symbolic bed placement. Actual, legal, paperwork-involved commitment." She was laughing and crying at the same time by the time she said yes, dropping to her knees in front of me, so we were level, kissing me before I'd even finished sliding the ring onto her finger properly. The two of us tangled together on the floor of a bedroom that had started as one person's temporary living arrangement and become, somewhere along the way, the place both our lives actually lived. Derek walked her down the aisle 8 months later, since their father wasn't there to do it, and he gave a wedding toast that started gruff and overprotective and ended, unexpectedly, with him admitting he'd never seen his sister look more like herself than she had in the years since that hospital scare, more settled, more secure, more exactly who she was always meant to become. He also, to everyone's surprise, made a joke about bed frames that got the whole reception laughing, proof that even Derek had eventually made peace with how this all started. Devin cried through the entire ceremony and blamed the venue's air conditioning for her mascara, a line nobody bothered challenging, and true to her earlier threat, played her secret recording of Jesse's bed-moving confession during her own toast, to Jesse's mortified delight. My mother, who had spotted the truth months before either of us admitted it, sat in the front row looking thoroughly unsurprised by the whole event. The particular satisfaction of a parent who called it correctly reserved carefully behind a polite, proud smile. We bought a house 2 years later, a small place with actual separate rooms we didn't need anymore, because by then there was only one bed in the plan, no 4 feet of careful distance left to close. We kept the old bed frame anyway, moved it into the guest room, half joke and half genuine sentiment, and every time someone new stayed over and asked why we'd bothered hauling such an ordinary, slightly battered frame across town, Jesse would just smile and say it had sentimental value, and leave it at that, because some stories are better told slowly, over wine, with all the details intact. Sometimes, late at night, Jesse still brings up the story, usually when we're explaining to new friends how we got together, and she always tells it the same way, laughing at herself a little. I panicked, she says, and instead of just telling him how I felt, I rearranged an entire bedroom while he was recovering from surgery, like some kind of romantic burglar. And I always add the same line back. Best burglary I've ever been the victim of. It still makes her laugh every time. The same bright, familiar laugh that used to carry through apartment walls back when neither of us understood yet what we were actually building between 2 bedrooms and 8 months of careful distance that closed, in the end, by exactly 4 feet. So tell me, if you came home from the hospital and found your roommate had quietly moved their whole bed closer to yours while you were gone, what would you have said in that doorway? And have you ever had a moment of crisis force you to finally admit a feeling you'd been circling for months without the courage to name it? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.